The crimson sun of Acheron Prime cast long, jagged shadows across the rust-colored landscape, struggling to penetrate the perpetual, sulphurous haze that clung to the extraction outpost Acheron Station. This desolate rock, classified as a Class 7 ecological death trap by the Unified Frontier Authority, was less a colony and more a tenacious scab on the galactic fringe, dedicated to mining the volatile hypersilicates buried deep beneath its crust. Life here was cheap, and the constant, low-frequency tremor from the subterranean drills served as a nervous, irritating heartbeat for the 50-odd souls trapped within the prefabricated habitat domes. Among the crew, a pervasive dread overshadowed the promise of wealth, a fear synthesized by the planet's native apex predator. Kalen Kale Thorne, the station's xenobotanist and reluctant scout, felt this tension more keenly than most. Unlike the gruff miners and security officers who treated the planet as an obstacle to be overcome, Kale viewed Acheron Prime as a complex, deadly puzzle. His workspace, a small, climate-controlled biolab reeking faintly of ozone and exotic fungal spores, was his sanctuary. Today, however, his focus was fractured. Reports from automated perimeter drones indicated a sudden, inexplicable bloom of Luminaris mycosolis, a rare, bioluminescent fungus that required solar exposure to stabilize, an impossible trait for flora in this dim environment. This growth had occurred a full kilometer outside the established buffer zone, necessitating a risky field excursion. Kale slid into his lightweight survey suit, its pale gray plating offering minimal protection but maximum agility, a trade-off he often preferred to the clunky, power-hungry exosuits favored by security. His reputation on the station was one of quiet competence mixed with unnerving detachment. He was the one who went where others wouldn't, driven by a scholastic obsession with the planet's silent biome. He carried only a handheld geological sensor, a sampling kit and a vibroknife, standard issue, primarily useless against their true enemy. That enemy was the Carewell. The creature was not large in the traditional sense, but its efficiency was legendary and horrifying. The Carewell possessed chitinous armor plates that absorbed ambient light and noise, rendering them invisible to almost every conventional sensor. They hunted in a state of absolute preternatural silence, moving through the dense, petrified forests like wraiths. There were no tracks, no warning calls, only the sudden, brutal removal of life. Security Officer Vance had often snarled that the Carewell didn't kill, they merely made you cease to exist. Every prior encounter recorded in station logs ended with a missing person, a splatter of blood on the rust-colored soil, and a single terrifying truth: the Carewell never failed a kill. As Kale passed the airlock, the station commander, Captain Rorick, a man hardened by decades on the fringe, stopped him. Thorne, this is beyond the parameters. The Luminaris can wait. That zone is a Carewell nesting territory. We lost 2 people there last cycle. Respectfully, Captain, Kale replied, his voice calm, the fungus bloom is unprecedented. It suggests a major, rapid environmental shift. If we don't document it now, we risk losing the data and missing a crucial clue about their ecology. I'll be quick and silent. Rorick sighed, his heavy features etched with worry. You live in a world of variables, Thorne. The Carewell is a constant. An absolute. Get in, get out. You have 1 hour. Kale gave a concise nod and stepped into the airlock. The transition to the open air was a dizzying shift. The pressurized hum of the station replaced by the thick, metallic scent of the planet and the unnerving lack of natural sound. He deployed a microdrone for mapping but kept its sonic signature to a minimum, knowing the creature would detect even the slightest aberration. He moved with the almost painful caution of a professional tracker, placing each boot fall deliberately, merging his silhouette with the shadows of the needle-like, ferrous trees. He reached the anomaly's location precisely at the 30-minute mark. The Luminaris glowed faintly, a ghostly ethereal blue, illuminating a small clearing. It was beautiful, impossible, and immediately suspect. He dropped to one knee, deploying his sampling kit. His focus narrowed to the intricate structure of the fungi, cataloging its mutation. This singular, intellectual focus often served as a shield against the pervasive terror of the planet. But today the shield shattered. The deep silence Kale was accustomed to was suddenly replaced by something deeper, something heavier, a silence so profound it felt like pressure building behind his eardrums. Every primal instinct screamed the same message: it is here. He spun, dropping his sampling tray, his hand instinctively fumbling for the vibroknife. It was too late. The Carewell, a masterwork of biomechanical horror, materialized not from the shadows, but from the very air directly above him. Its multifaceted bioluminescent eyes, normally dimmed to invisibility, flared momentarily with predatory intensity, a sudden, blinding green that showed Kale every ridge of its armored carapace and the sleek, surgical curve of the retractable mandible poised to strike. Kale was disarmed, prone, and staring up at the absolute end of his life. In that final, frozen fraction of a second, with the smell of ozone and death in the air, Kale did not raise a weapon or scream. Instead, driven by an impulse utterly foreign to survival, he raised his bare, exposed right hand. The Kerwellel's presence was a seismic event contained within a single, terrifying form. The retractable killing appendage, a specialized extension of its forelimb, was a blur of chitin and hyperdense muscle, stopping not a centimeter from the fragile biopolymer of Kale's helmet visor. The air displaced by the sudden halt tasted of burnt iron and something acridly alien. Kale's heart hammered a frantic, useless rhythm against his ribs, yet a strange, cold clarity settled over his mind, overriding the primal urge to thrash or flee. He was dead, but the executioner had paused. It was this pause, this anomaly in the KRWL's relentless, flawless protocol, that catalyzed his next reckless action. All prior knowledge, all reports, all security doctrine, insisted the KRWL operated purely on a stimulus-response loop. Detection equals termination. There was no hesitation, no assessment. Yet it was hesitating. Kale saw the brief, intense flash of green light in its compound eyes as they cycled, not with malice, but with a momentary, inexplicable lag, as if its internal processor had jammed on a corrupted data file. With painstaking slowness, defying every screaming nerve ending, Kale completed the gesture he had started. His hand, shaking less from fear than from the sheer absurdity of the act, reached up, not in defense but in contact. He did not attempt to grasp, push, or strike. He simply rested the flat of his gloved palm against the creature's face. The surface was a tapestry of specialized armor, hard, ridged chitin near the jaw, but dissolving into a softer, almost velvety texture near the sensory nodes that flanked its ocular clusters. It was cold, unnaturally so, absorbing ambient heat, and beneath the armor, Kale could perceive a faint, subtle vibration, a nearly subsonic frequency that registered as a deep, resonant hum, the sound of the silent hunter's internal life systems. The result of the touch was immediate and absolute. The Kerwellel, which had been a coiled spring ready to unleash final violence, became an inert sculpture. The retractable mandible remained frozen in its descent. The creature's terrifying bioluminescence dimmed perceptibly, the green light softening to a muted, internal glow, as if energy were being diverted from aggressive action to intense sensory input. Its attention was fixed entirely on the point of contact, a motionless study of the human hand that had offered data rather than defense. The silence that followed was the longest, most profound Kale had ever experienced. It was not the prey silence of the jungle, but a shared void where the rules of predator and prey had momentarily dissolved. Kale focused on his breathing, shallow and controlled, determined not to ruin the delicate equilibrium he had accidentally established. His mind, the xenobotanist's mind, frantically attempted to categorize this behavior. Was it confusion? A sensory overload? Perhaps the simple, non-aggressive presence of flesh where its programming expected violent resistance had crashed the kill sequence. Minutes bled into the oppressive stillness. Kale refused to withdraw his hand, maintaining the strange, intimate connection. He studied the creature's eyes, thousands of facets reflecting the faint blue light of the surrounding luminaris fungus. He saw not hatred or hunger but intense, unwavering analysis. It was processing the anomaly of an organism offering vulnerability instead of fighting for survival. Finally, the impossible stasis broke. The Kerwellel did not attack. It did not recoil violently. Instead, it executed a precise, controlled retraction. The lethal mandible snapped back into its housing with an almost metallic snick. The creature lifted its head, pulling away from Kale's hand with the slow, deliberate motion of an entity concluding a complex experiment. Its compound eyes held Kale's gaze for one final, penetrating moment. In that look, Kale recognized a definitive, almost intellectual choice being made, a refusal. Then the Kerwellel was gone. Not a rapid, terrifying charge into the undergrowth, but a seamless, instantaneous dissolution. Its specialized camouflage re-engaged perfectly, and the creature simply winked out of existence, leaving no discernible trace, no broken branch, no displaced pebble. Kale was alone again, the silence of the forest returning, heavy but inert. The luminaris continued to glow, providing the only witness to the impossible reprieve. Kale lay there for a long time, the cold imprint of the Kerwellel's armor still tingling on his gloved palm. He finally sat up, retrieving his discarded knife and sampling kit, his movements methodical and detached, as if the last 10 minutes had been an out-of-body observation. He was alive, untouched, spared by the absolute apex predator. The Carwell had chosen not to kill him. This was a truth so earth-shattering it redefined his understanding of the planet and his own species' capacity to interact with it. He finished collecting his samples in a daze, his scientific curiosity now violently redirected from the flora to the silent killer. He had encountered a profound, deadly intelligence and he carried its secret, the terrible knowledge that the Carwell was capable of choice. As he began the arduous journey back to the outpost, the silence of the jungle no longer felt like a precursor to death, but like the heavy responsibility of an unnatural truce. The implications of this contact were vast, and he knew he could never share the truth of his survival. Kale returned to Acheron Station not as a victim delivered from peril, but as a man burdened by an unbelievable, world-shifting secret. He delivered his samples, provided a sanitized account of an equipment malfunction necessitating a quick retreat, and watched the station personnel nod with bored acceptance. The Carwell to them remained a constant, monolithic terror. The idea of its behavioral variability was simply too unsettling to entertain. Kale's silence on the encounter was less an act of self-preservation and more a conscious effort to protect the anomaly, the Carwell that spared him. In the ensuing days, Kale became an island of tense contemplation within the bustling chaos of the outpost. He meticulously reviewed every piece of archived Carwell behavioral data, every grainy thermal image, every autopsy report. He was searching not for patterns of attack, but for instances of inaction, a pursuit that only solidified his certainty that the event was singular. His theory solidified. The Carwell's hyper-efficient sensory system was its greatest weapon, but also its potential flaw. The non-aggressive touch, the offering of zero-threat data, had short-circuited the hunter's relentless programming. His obsession was subtle but consuming. He began to dedicate his off-hours to adapting a suite of xenological sensors, not to defend or attack but to communicate. He fashioned a complex emitter, calibrated to pulse light and low-frequency vibrations mirroring the subtle hum he had felt beneath the Carwell's armor, a non-threatening analytical offering. Under the pretense of testing a new atmospheric analyzer, he slipped out 2 cycles later, returning to the patch of Luminaris. He didn't wait for the Carwell. Instead, he placed the humming sensor array in the precise center of the clearing and retreated, leaving behind his peace offering. The station meanwhile settled into a false sense of security, the silence of the last few days wrongly interpreted as a retreat by the predators. The drilling intensity increased, pushing the energy core beyond recommended limits. Kale knew this reckless greed would attract trouble, but he expected the usual outcome: a quick, surgical strike removing 1 or 2 unsuspecting workers. The breach, when it came, was terrifying precisely because it was not surgical. An ear-splitting klaxon shrieked through the station, instantly plunging the habitation dome into emergency red lighting. Security reports were immediate and frantic. Perimeter breach, main conduit section. Multiple contacts, massive physical damage. The sounds of tearing metal and structural groan reverberated through the decking. Kale, grabbing his customized sensor unit, sprinted toward the main power hub, bypassing the confused security squad scrambling to arm themselves. He arrived at the scene of the chaos to find the breach was focused and devastating. It wasn't a generalized assault on the habitat, but a targeted demolition of the station's defensive infrastructure. A large Carwell was systematically tearing apart the bulky, pressurized housing units of the station's newly installed sonic disruptor banks, devices that emitted painful high-frequency waves meant to drive the creatures away. The creature wasn't killing the security personnel who fired wildly and ineffectually, it was ignoring them, focusing its formidable strength entirely on silencing the disruptive noise. Kale's breath hitched as he recognized the creature. Even amidst the violence, the Carwell's distinct size and the unique, shallow scratch pattern on its right flank, near where he had touched it, identified it conclusively. It was the one. But this time, it was not merely pausing a hunt. It was actively destroying the station's ability to operate in its silent environment. The Carwell finished demolishing the last disruptor housing, its compound eyes finally turning away from the wreckage and settling on the incoming human forces. Security Officer Vance, pale and sweating, raised a plasma rifle yelling, "Thorn, get behind me. We hit it with everything we've got. Fire." The Carwell shifted its weight, preparing for its next move, which Kale feared would finally be the expected devastating slaughter. Kale knew conventional weapons were almost useless against its shifting armor, and the creature was now alerted, its kill protocols fully engaged by the hostile barrage. In that critical instant, with the roar of plasma weapons charging behind him, Kale dropped his only defense, his vibroknife clattering uselessly on the metal deck. He stepped forward, putting himself directly between the heavily armed security team and the focused, silent rage of the KRL. He did not yell or plead. He extended his right hand again, palm open and vulnerable, stepping into the breach of absolute danger, gambling his life on the tiny, fragile anomaly he had initiated days before. His focus was entirely on the creature's eyes, willing it to remember the non-hostile input, hoping the impossible truce still held sway. The air crackled with the charged energy of imminent death. Vance's curse was a raw, visceral sound against the station's relentless alarm. "Thorn, you utter fool. Move or you're collateral." But the security officer's finger froze on the trigger. Kale stood motionless, his extended hand an insane, almost ritualistic gesture against the KRL, whose massive segmented head was now less than a meter away. This time, the creature's immediate response was not confusion, but a profound, palpable acknowledgement. The KRL didn't flinch, didn't recoil, and most shockingly, it didn't strike. It simply lowered its head, permitting Kale to place his hand directly against the cold, complex surface of its armor plating. Beneath his palm, the low, steady vibration Kale had previously sensed intensified slightly, morphing into a complex, subaudible resonance. A sound that felt less like a predatory warning and more like an intense, singular focus of internal energy. Kale felt a sudden, profound rush of understanding. The KRL was not operating on malice, it was operating on efficiency. He transmitted his realization to the terrified soldiers behind him without turning around. "Hold your fire. It's not attacking us. It was silencing the noise. The sonic disruptors interfere with its sensory apparatus. We built a sonic fence and it tore down the fence, not the inhabitants." The intense scrutiny in the KRL's compound eyes began to shift, moving past Kale to focus intently on the massive pulsing junction box of the main power conduit behind the security team. Kale felt the accompanying increase in the creature's subsonic hum, now radiating a clear, unmistakable distress signal. Simultaneously, Kale's custom sensor unit, still slung across his chest, began to flash a violent, deep amber warning. A sudden, critical spike in plasma pressure within the conduit that the station's automated systems hadn't yet registered. Kale made the intuitive, instantaneous leap. The fault wasn't a result of the KRL's attack, but a pre-existing instability in the station's overtaxed core. The creature, hyper-attuned to minute energetic imbalances in its territory, had registered the impending disaster. It hadn't just been tearing down annoyances, it had been drawn by the energy signature of the catastrophic failure about to happen. The KRL took a sharp, decisive step past Kale, brushing his shoulder. Vance and the security team instinctively raised their rifles, but before they could squeeze off a single, panicked shot, the KRL acted. It plunged one of its specialized, diamond-hard mandibles into a specific, sparking relay port on the junction box. A component Kale's sensor was screaming about, and with a sudden, silent torque, removed the unstable component entirely. The result was a blinding flash of contained, arcing electricity and the immediate, blessed return to normal system hum. The amber warning on Kale's sensor vanished. The threat of the plasma burst had been neutralized. The silent hunter, in its single-minded pursuit of ecological balance, had just saved the human outpost from annihilation. Silence descended, heavier and more complex than any before. The alarms ceased their wailing, replaced by the stunned, shallow breathing of the human crew. They had watched the creature they defined as pure evil walk through their lines, refuse to kill their comrade, and perform an act of unexpected, devastating salvation. The KRL slowly retracted its mandible, ignoring the security team who were now frozen in an agonizing paralysis of confusion and disbelief. It turned its gaze back to Kale. The profound analytical focus was still there, but now Kale perceived a finality to it, a sense of having concluded its intervention. It made a subtle internal shift, and from a fold in its armor plating, something dropped to the floor with a tiny tap. It was a perfectly formed chitin shard, glossy and dark, flawlessly shed. It was a trophy, a warning, or perhaps a sign, a physical token left not by a predator, but by an intellect that had chosen to communicate. The creature offered one last, long, penetrating stare at Kale, before effortlessly dissolving into the darkness of the breached power core, finally vanishing into the structural shadows of the station. Vance finally lowered his weapon, his voice a bewildered whisper. It fixed the core. It saw the instability and fixed it. Cale knelt, picking up the shard. It pulsed with a residual warmth. He was alive, the station was safe, and he held the proof of an impossible, silent contract. But Captain Rorik arrived moments later, his face set in grim fury. "Thorn, you defied orders, risked the entire crew, and allowed a Class 7 predator to infiltrate the critical systems. Regardless of the outcome, your actions are reckless and treasonous. Security, confine him. And prepare the extermination protocols. This proves they are intelligent enough to be a strategic threat." Cale was marched away, the chitin shard clutched tightly in his hand, the reluctant prophet of an inconvenient truth. Cale was confined to the station's detention module, a small, sterile cage built more for bureaucratic isolation than actual security. His prison was the only quiet place left on Acheron Station, which now buzzed with the frantic, terrified energy of a society convinced it had survived a terrorist attack rather than been saved by a predator. Captain Rorik had moved quickly, convening a summary tribunal, his primary focus shifting from station management to damage control for the corporate overlords who monitored Acheron Prime. The official report was chilling. Calen Thorne had deliberately aided a sentient, hostile entity, proving the KRWL's intelligence and justifying its immediate, systemic eradication. Rorik's voice, amplified by the intercom, was cold and absolute. The KRWL's capacity for targeted sabotage confirms it is not mere animal life. It is an organized threat. The corporate-mandated xenocidal response team, along with the atmospheric disruptor payload, arrives within the hour. Thorne, your testimony is irrelevant. You are a liability. Clutching the chitin shard, the Silent Hunter's token, Cale understood the true danger was not the KRWL, but the absolute, terrified human need for categorization. They could accept a mindless beast, but they could not tolerate a calculating intelligence that chose to spare them. Their fear demanded genocide. With a narrow window of time remaining, Cale focused his entire being on the fragment. Using the concealed transmitter in his wrist-mounted biosensor, a modification previously overlooked, he began to analyze the shard's residual energy signature. It wasn't inert, it carried the faint, rhythmic subsonic pulse of the KRWL's internal hum, the same frequency he had felt during the touch. He didn't know what message to send, only that he had to try to warn his reluctant ally of the coming extermination. He began transmitting a complex pattern of light pulses and ultra-low frequency vibrations, a rhythm of increasing agitation and alarm, deliberately based on the creature's own internal cadence, a message of imbalance and aggression approaching its territory. The minute hand on the module's chronometer crawled agonizingly toward the scheduled arrival of the xenocidal response team's heavily armored dropship. The station shuddered as the massive vessel entered orbit and began its brutal descent. Cale stood by the tiny viewport, watching the sky split open. He had done all he could. The rest was a matter of probability, and the KRWL, Cale knew, always maximized its probability of survival. The dropship impacted a kilometer from the outpost, immediately deploying its ground forces. 3 armored specialists tasked with setting up the xenocidal disruptor field, a weapon designed to boil the atmospheric moisture out of all biological life in a wide radius. As the soldiers moved towards the jungle perimeter, the profound silence returned, not the inert silence of the jungle, but the absolute pre-kill stillness Cale knew so intimately. Then the jungle exploded not with violence but with focused, surgical fury. A pack of KRWL, dozens strong, materialized from the shadows, led by the unmistakable scarred form of the predator. They were not in a hunting formation, they were in a strategic deployment. The pack bypassed the heavily armed human soldiers entirely, demonstrating a terrifying, collective objective. They converged solely on the disruptor payload and the transport vehicle itself. The ensuing climax was a masterpiece of silent, controlled devastation. The KRWL didn't engage in prolonged combat. Their movements were instantaneous and decisive. Their mandibles and specialized appendages plunged into the weapon's vital processors and the dropship's engine core. In less than 30 seconds, the xenocidal weapon was reduced to sparking debris, and the armored transport was rendered a ruined husk. The KRWL then vanished just as quickly as they appeared, leaving the 3 xenocidal response specialists unharmed but reeling in shock among the wreckage. Captain Rorik, Vance, and the remaining crew watched the impossible scene unfold on the main external monitors. The Silent Hunters had made their final choice clear. They were protectors of their own ecosystem, and they were willing to enforce a truce. They attacked only the existential threat, recognizing the humans who carried weapons were not the true danger. The predator that had spared Cale detached itself from the vanishing pack. It glided towards the perimeter fence, stopping exactly where Kale's sensor offering had been placed. It paused, its entire body language radiating the same intense analysis Kale remembered. Kale, watching through the viewport, understood. The creature wasn't waiting for a signal, it was giving a silent, final confirmation. Suddenly, a security guard burst into Kale's cell, keying the lock. "Captain's orders. Get out. We're shutting down the drilling operation. We have to talk." Kale stepped out of the cell, no longer an accused traitor but an indispensable intermediary. He walked to the main observation deck where Rorik stood, his face a complex mask of defeat, wonder and survival. Kale looked out at the distant, silent jungle, knowing the KRWL was watching, listening. "They protected us, Thorn," Rorik finally admitted, the tremor in his voice profound. "They saved the station from the corporation's madness." "Why?" Kale looked down at the silent, cold chitin shard in his hand. His character arc was complete. He had begun as a detached scientist, evolved into a reckless experimentalist, and now stood as a reluctant ambassador. "They didn't kill me because I offered non-hostile information," he explained, his voice low but firm. "They saved us because the threat to their home, the weapon, was greater than the nuisance of our presence. They are highly intelligent, selective, and they have defined us. We are not prey but we are certainly not masters." The official reports changed immediately, the truth too powerful to suppress. The KRWL were reclassified as protected apex sapients. The outpost became less an extraction site and more a restricted ecological observation post. Kale was given command of the entire Xenoscience division, his methods and insights now the only path forward. Days later, Kale stood alone at the edge of the perimeter fence, watching the sun set over the petrified forest. The low, familiar hum of a nearby KRWL was a subtle reassurance. He didn't fear it. The terms of their silent contract were simple: respect the silence and the silence will not break you. The predator that hunts in silence had refused to kill the human who touched its face, and in that refusal had granted humanity a precarious, terrifying, yet hopeful foothold in a universe too complex to conquer.